Okay, the recording has started.
Okay, thanks, Hanta. Right, good afternoon, everyone. It's a warm welcome to our English department seminar series. So let me perhaps begin by thanking you for making the time to join us today. Our seminar series occurs normally every fortnight. That's when all things are equal. And if not, our very able communications team led by our presenter today, Hanta Henning, will update on any changes to the schedule. Right, so basically the seminar series is a platform for showcasing ongoing research. It is meant to trigger conversations around new research, new topics, new ideas, etc., etc. And our speaker for today is someone who really needs no introduction. We have actually previously enjoyed her fascinating work on adoption narratives, and she's back today with another, I'm sure, quite interesting installment on adoption narratives. So Hanta Henning is a published poet. She's also an English lecturer in the Department of English at the UFS and also a PhD student. Her research focuses on South African adoption narratives, adoption trauma, resilience, kinship, and representations of the adoption triangle, of course, amongst many other interesting topics. Her latest article, Mothering and Othering, Reading Fearless Child as an Adoption Narrative, will appear in the special issue of Alternation that's coming later this year. Perhaps already we should congratulate you, Hanta, for that, I'm sure, very fine piece of work. So Hanta today is going to talk about Hitler, Verwoerd, Mandela, and me. Of course, that's not me, but that's, of course, Marian Tam. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And the presentation will focus on reciprocal adoption between immigrants and countries. Hanta Henning.
Thank you very much, Oliver. Okay, I hope you can all see the presentation and me, I hope. I'm going to get started. All right. The memoir Hitler, Verwoerd, Mandela and Me sketches the life of Marianne Tam, a child of European immigrants who came to South Africa during the apartheid era. Though this memoir does discuss Tam's adoption of 2 children, this is not what I will focus on today. Instead, I focus on how in this memoir, the concept of adoption is extended beyond that of parents adopting a child. In fact, what is foregrounded here is the adoption of and adaptation to a new country by immigrants. As in the case of adopting a child, this extended adoption triangle is mired in trauma, rejection, and double consciousness. As South Africa's adoptee, Tam struggles to come to terms with the cultural, social, and political ideologies pervading the country during the apartheid regime. Similarly, South Africa, as the adopter, have qualms about the suitability of the immigrant as an adoptee. But before we explore this further, I want to provide a short synopsis of this memoir. Tam's German father, Georg, was a prisoner of war after World War II. He was also a member of the Nazi youth movement and fought for Adolf Hitler. After World War II, he was taken to the United Kingdom. After his release, he met Barbara, a Portuguese woman, similarly displaced by the war and now working in the UK. After Georg is offered a job in South Africa, the Tam family immigrate to and settle in an immigrant neighborhood in Pretoria, where families from continental Europe choose to settle. Here they create new bonds of nuclear families, extended community, and non-genetic kinship, a pattern Tam would repeat later in her life by adopting her children. Along with these consanguineal bonds, Tam provides paradigm shifts surrounding the thinking of family, community, kinship, and belonging. Throughout the early chapters, Tam describes her friends, especially the expatriate neighbors and school friends, as a closely knit community which functions like a family. This family does not, however, escape conflict with the white Afrikaans community, who throughout much of the memoir remains the main antagonist. In the context of this memoir, the adoption triangle is also extended. Not only are the biological and adoptive parents as well as adoptees positioned in these maps, but the Tam's country of origin takes the figurative position of biological parent, South Africa as the adoptee, and the Tams as adoptive parent. And in the same breath, South Africa is also sometimes cast in the role of adoptive parent, with the Tams and other immigrants as its adoptees. Cultural maps feature significantly in this memoir, as Tam and her parents navigate their way through language barriers, an oppressive political regime and its implications for South African citizens, South African identities during the apartheid era, as well as new traditions and social practices. Tam's cognitive affective map also comes into play as she navigates and traverses the paths, boundaries, districts, nodes, and landmarks of both her physical and affective environments. Related here to are Lefebvre's concept of everyday life intersections, concerned with, quote, illusion and truth, power and helplessness, the intersection of the sector man controls and the sector he does not control. McCreevy and Argent state that this framework is especially applicable in the context of immigration, as it enables the contextualization of relationships between agency and structure in the immigration process. Finally, the semantic maps Tam employs in navigating her way through her adoption of this new country, as well as interracial adoption, bears discussion. I'll discuss the navigation of these maps based on the bifocal lenses of Singley's work on narrative strands in the adoption memoir. In brief, Singley identifies two narrative strands as constituents of adoption memoirs. In the first strand, the adopted child is saved from desperate circumstances, which allows the child to participate in terms of their representation in national narratives addressing new beginnings. The adoptee's identity is thus affected in the sense that they are involved in larger narratives by acting as agents in the creation of new maps and by representing the territory of adoption, which is especially true in Tam's adoption of a new country. In the second strand, the adoptee remains dependent on their roots based on gender, race, class, and so on, or is shown as being unworthy of adoption. This strand is especially relevant as the socio-political apartheid milieu in which Tam's memoir is initially set essentially renders her and her family as unworthy of being adopted. What also bears discussion is what is called in adoption studies a reunion journey. Reunion journeys refer to adoptees embarking on a search for their biological parents. Outcomes are often mixed, sometimes marked by disappointment and rejection, and other times by a rekindling of biological ties. At the cusp of apartheid's inevitable downfall and the uncertainty of what a post-apartheid South Africa will entail, Tam travels to Europe, undertaking a kind of reunion journey. I argue that Tam's navigation of the geographic, social, and linguistic spaces in a new country of residence aids in the creation of her cognitive affective map. At the same time, the cognitive affective map of adopting a new country is applied twofold. Firstly, Tam's aforementioned map-making allows her to meaningfully engage in the two narrative memoir strands identified by Singley. Regarding the first strand, her representation of herself as the country's adoptee enables her to take part in a new beginnings narrative and to show how she takes agency and admits culpability in the need for this narrative to be created. As for the second strand, Tam reflects on immigrants' unadoptability in their new country, exposing normative prejudices, injustices, and ideologies in the process. Further, she uses her agency as a journalist in an effort to expose how this unadoptability extends to the Black population in apartheid South Africa. In essence, what Tam does is she engages in problematizing the normativity of unadoptability, navigating the terrain of apartheid and post-apartheid South Africa. I'll elaborate on this concept of unadoptability and the new beginnings narrative by situating immigrants' language barriers, as well as the concept of bordering and ordering in the context of apartheid South Africa as typified in the memoir. But first, I need to provide a brief synopsis of apartheid immigration. In apartheid South Africa, immigration and migration took place according to what Segati and Landau call a two-gate policy. The front gate admitted immigrants or migrants who were white, desirable to the country, especially in terms of the skilled labor they could provide, and who did not threaten the so-called European culture the country strived to emulate. South Africa allowed and welcomed white immigrants from European countries, as well as white migrants from neighboring African states to, quote, boost the local population, according to Maharaj. Admissions through the back gate allowed into the country migrants, usually from neighboring countries, who were temporarily and often clandestinely allowed into the country to work in such fields as mining and agriculture. This allowed South Africa to amass a relatively cheap and docile workforce, for whom deportation served as a constant reminder to toe the line. Segati and Landau further say that this system allowed a blurring of lines regarding who the country's citizens were, specifically who comprised the country's indigenous population and who were considered foreigners. This system is an example of coercive migration policies and the stereotyping of foreigners, depending on whether they came from neighboring countries or from Europe. It was in 1961 that a proactive white immigration policy was instituted, when the ruling National Party, using white immigrants to address the country's problem of a lack of white skilled laborers. The state made available subsidies and grants to enable mainly European immigrants to enter and settle in the country. Klotz notes that the apartheid government actively sought white settlers, and she calls these immigration and migration policies an example of identity politics, where a clear distinction was created between immigrants, or white skilled laborers, and refugees, unskilled black laborers. Nevertheless, despite this distinction, both of these groups comprise immigrants, which enables one to identify legal insiders and outsiders in the country's social makeup. It is against the backdrop of this inequality of the indigenous white South versus the immigrant white other that Tam's memoir should be read. As the child of an immigrant German father and Portuguese mother, Tam describes the white against white discrimination not often mentioned in apartheid literature. Such discrimination was rooted firstly in language. Afrikaans was the language of the Christian national government, the language of newspapers, police, government, and schools, and the English language was the assumed language of the colonizer, the oppressor, and the skilled immigrant. Allowing foreigners who spoke mainly English, but also their native tongues, into the country exacerbated the discrimination against the immigrants of the time. Pereira notes that immigrants are often discriminated against when lacking competence in the dominant language of their newly adopted country, in this case Afrikaans. This was especially prevalent during the time the Tams immigrated to South Africa. Secondly, the question of who white South Africans really were came into play. Chinese and Indian immigrants, for example, were classified under the apartheid regime as Asiatics, not white and not black, but with many of the same restrictions in terms of movement, procurement of property, residence, and free trade as was applicable to the oppressed black citizens. During the first 3 to 4 decades of apartheid, says Park, a need for Asian trading partners to boost the South African economy gave Asian countries some clout in South Africa. And as a result, the status of Asian citizens in the country increased. Many Chinese citizens were treated as, quote, honorary whites and were increasingly treated as white. The term honorary white was originally coined to refer to some non-white and part-white groups in South Africa during apartheid. It can be argued that European immigrants too were seen as honorary whites. While some, like certain German immigrants, espoused the white Protestant ideology of South Africa at the time, others, like Tam's Portuguese mother, were categorized as, quote, individuals who, in a racial hierarchy with whites at the top and blacks at the bottom, occupy a preferred intermediate status, according to Twan. But they were not completely accepted into white South African society. Tam therefore writes from the position of a white immigrant, mainly discriminated against by the Afrikaans white community surrounding her for being English, a foreigner, and a child of mixed heritage. As her mother was Portuguese, Tam would likely also have experienced specific inter-white anti-Portuguese discrimination in South Africa. Glaser notes that during the late 1960s and early 1970s in apartheid South Africa, the political establishment and Afrikaner community became increasingly concerned with the exponential growth of the Portuguese community in the country. Portuguese immigrants were named as undesirable by the political establishment, and their whiteness was questioned by Afrikaner nationalists. Furthermore, in the 60s and 70s, South Africa was involved in a complicated border war with Angola. Initially, the Portuguese military assisted South Africa in its military endeavors, but following the Carnation Revolution in Portugal, where the regime of Estado Novo was overthrown in a military coup, the Portuguese military was withdrawn from Angola, leaving South Africa without their support. This directly and negatively influenced South Africa's economic capital and the country itself, which led to increased discrimination against Portuguese citizens in South Africa. This often led to what Pereira says, Portuguese immigrants feeling, quote, worthless, undervalued, and unwanted, which in turn impacted the acculturation process. The preceding section alluded to Afrikaans being the primary language of apartheid South Africa, and much can be said about the suppression of native South African languages in the apartheid era, but that is not the main focus at the moment. Rather, it is important here to understand that the Afrikaans-English divide was a seat of tension during this time. Though what is now known as the 11 official South African languages did exist, the language of government and media and the majority of academic instruction was Afrikaans. Tension was rife between the English and Afrikaans, the animosity rooted in the British conquering and colonization of South Africa in 1822. For the Afrikaner people, their language was, and to a large extent still remains, the chief symbol of their cultural distinctness, engraved in Afrikaner ideology, identity, and character. From 1948 until 1994, Afrikaners were the dominant force in South African politics. With apartheid instituted by Afrikaners came the institutionalization of Afrikaner character, culture, and language. English, seen as the language of the enemy, became grounds for discrimination. Based on the number of South African speakers, Afrikaans and English were more or less on equal footing. Yet despite English being an official language, quote, the business of government and administration was conducted almost exclusively in Afrikaans, says Silva. English had a lower cultural status than Afrikaans, with the majority of state resources being allocated to the development of the Afrikaans language. The Afrikaner nationalist hegemony succeeded in creating the myth that only they spoke for the Afrikaner, and their worldview was a substantial expression of what it meant to be an Afrikaans-speaking citizen. Afrikaans was employed by these nationalist culture brokers to suppress what Willemse calls oppositional and alternative thought within the Afrikaner community. English was very much the language that signified liberalism, oppositional thinking, and black unity. This was further exacerbated by English being adopted as the language of instruction in many South African independent homelands, such as Transkei, and being used as the language of instruction in most black educational institutions. These aspects and the fact that English was seen as the language of those who considered themselves to be the social elite, however warped this perception may have been, led to widespread prejudice towards and the ostracizing of English-speaking individuals. The situation was even more dire for English-speaking immigrants, as explicated in the following section. Integration and thus assimilation of the immigrants' new country's language, practices, traditions, and social mores is the envisioned end stage of the immigration process. Motti Stefanidis says, and I quote, culturally competent immigrants are able to communicate effectively in national languages and can code switch between languages as necessary. In Tam's memoir, it becomes apparent that her father, Georg, could effectively meet some of these criteria, while her mother, Barbara, could not. As a prisoner of war, Georg received English instruction while in prison. Barbara, on the other hand, had little to no grasp of the English language. Even after their relocation to South Africa, English continued to be a struggle, and neither of them acquired Afrikaans as a language. But for Tam and her brother, the situation was different. Though they both attended English schools, Afrikaans was a compulsory subject. And Tam notes that she acquired the language not only because she had an aptitude for languages, but also because she found that she liked the Afrikaans language. But she caveats this with the statement, quote, I just didn't like the people who claimed it as uniquely their own. Indeed, the tension between Afrikaans and English was not merely seated in the languages, but in the Afrikaner and English identities. In the following exchange between Tam and an Afrikaans man cruising their neighborhood, we see Tam's assimilation of the Afrikaans language and how she incorporates it into her English vernacular. I have to give you some context. Bruce Street is a well-known street in Pretoria, and it is a humorous name because Bruce is akin to the word poes, which is Afrikaans for cunt. Excuse my language. Ach man, excuse me. Do you know where we can find Bruce Street? He asked with a knowing smile. Yeah, I think I can help you. You turn left when you get to Peel Street, take a quick right at Holst Road, and then immediately left again into Bull Street, I replied. He drove off, disappointed. This and many other examples indicate that Tam uses language as a shield. Instead of rejecting the language of the oppressor, she adopts it as her own and uses it to empower herself. Yet she was still conflicted between her love of the language and her disdain for those who had forced it on her and on so many others, and who used it as a tool of oppression and suppression. Though Tam's semantic map does include Afrikaans, the language, when quoted or referred to, serves rather as societal commentary than examples of how the language is spoken. In other words, Tam succeeds in showing that, as Hayakawa says, the symbol is not the thing symbolized, the word is not the thing, the map is not the territory it stands for. And as Korzybski notes, maps are self-reflexive. Thus, we use semantic maps to refer to part of the territory, which become reflexive of other parts of the maps at varying levels of abstraction. Therefore, we make maps of maps. Furthermore, this implies that the semantic map is only part of the territory and not the entire territory itself. Afrikaans, therefore, is not the territory of the language only, but becomes a map describing the territory of the Afrikaner mindset, its beliefs, ideologies, and practices. Tam often uses Afrikaans as an adjective, Afrikaans families, Afrikaans children, Afrikaans newspapers, rather than using it as a proper noun referring to the language itself. A description of Afrikaans families is that they are overtly hostile to immigrants and English speakers. Being English allows her to distance herself, at least mentally, from apartheid atrocities, to believe that being English is a show of resistance to the apartheid regime. She aims to queer the Afrikaans status quo by speaking and writing in English. It is to her the language of truth, the language in which the grim reality of apartheid is exposed and critiqued. When interviewing for a position as a journalist at the English newspaper The Cape Times much later, she says that she wants to be a journalist because she wants to tell the truth. This relates to Singlei's first adoption narrative strand, where the adoptee takes part in national narratives of new beginnings through the creation of new semantic maps. In intention, if not yet in practice, Tam aims to change the nationalist denialist discourse by shaping new maps that represent the reality of the socio-political situation under the apartheid regime. However, Tam does later note that in her reporter's notebook, what she wrote became a distraction from reality instead of a reflection thereof. Again, language becomes a shield, but instead of empowering her, it insulates her. This is because the institutionalized Afrikaans culture, enforced through the Afrikaans language, taught her that speaking out about injustice led to isolation and prejudice. Tam's semantic map is molded through both Afrikaans and English. Though she becomes proficient in and even embraces Afrikaans, she continues to use it as a symbol that signifies oppression and injustice in South Africa, and as an adjectival missive for Afrikaner culture and its ingrained prejudices. Immigrants may internalize semantic maps perpetuated in society around them, which illuminate human biases and stereotypes that perpetuate social inequalities against immigrants. This links to Hayakawa's position that semantic maps are acquired by individuals as they are advanced by others. For Tam, language becomes a navigational tool she uses to shield herself from the realities of her adopted country, but which she also realizes she can use to resist, oppose, and expose the political and racial injustices of the country she has adopted, thus embodying Singlei's concept of national narratives of new beginnings. Pecho notes that placemaking is a pivotal concept as immigrants move from their origin to their destination countries. Placemaking implies that immigrants have legitimate rights to their new space, and it is problematized in the sense of immigrants in that such individuals often have tenuous relationships with the new spaces they inhabit. This implies that immigrants need to, quote, engage in a series of displacements that remove them from embodied experiences and in-location perceptions of their communities, according to Taylor et al. This displacement necessarily suggests the troubling of immigrants' cognitive maps. With immigration, cognitive maps have to be extended to what Popescu calls bordering and ordering. This implies that in a globalized world, which is purportedly unbound, borders and the ordering of people and places still exist. Not only boundaries between countries, but also political, socio-economic, racial, and cultural boundaries are expanded in the form of discourses that include spatialization, power relations, and boundary-making practices. Spatial borderings and orderings also contribute to identity construction, say van Houten et al. Parsi argues for greater insight into how these spaces are socially constructed. Spatial socialization, which may manifest in media discourse, foreign policy, and immigrant adaptation, contributes to the spatialization of identity. And this spatialization of identity increases the likelihood of a self versus other mentality, with certain groups or individuals inhabiting certain spaces others do or cannot. This has led to a fine meshwork of intercultural and intercountry boundaries. Such boundaries may often become hard edges of friction and conflict, a highly precarious setting where self and others are caught in a multitude of polarities and tensions, such as between domestic and immigrant populations. This clearly troubles the semantic maps of immigrants, as they do not or cannot necessarily inhabit the spaces or create internalized maps of such spaces based on their assumed alterity. In terms of Tam's memoir, this would point to the second narrative strand proposed by Singley, where adoptees, or in this case immigrants, are seen as unworthy of adoption as they remain dependent on their roots. The Tam family immigrated to South Africa in 1963, and Tam describes them as being, quote, marooned in Pretoria. She immediately seeks into the construction of a cognitive affective map of not only the neighborhood where the family settles, but of South Africa as a whole. South Africa, she says, is ruled by, quote, an authoritarian, white, separatist, nationalist regime and Hendrik Verwoerd, the father of apartheid. Um, their neighborhood was one filled with new immigrants, and I quote again, artisans like my father who had been lured to South Africa by the nationalist government because they were white and had skills the country needed. She further explains that this neighborhood was surrounded by a hostile lager of working and newly middle-class Afrikaners who viewed the immigrants with suspicion, hostility, and contempt. Indeed, just because these immigrants chose to adopt South Africa as their new homeland, it did not automatically mean acceptance into their new communities and country. On the contrary, immigrants had to be Afrikanerized. The Afrikaner Broederbond is a secretive and highly exclusive Afrikaner nationalist organization. Along with the National Party, they largely steered South Africa's political development in a way that promoted the political, economic, and cultural interests of the Afrikaner. The Broederbond encouraged local communities to incorporate immigrant families into white Afrikaans communities. This again speaks to Singley's first narrative strand. The adoptee or immigrant can take part in the formation of new cultural maps and narratives of new beginnings, provided they assimilated to the Afrikaner culture. As to how this was to be done, Wilkins and Strydom say in their book, The Super Afrikaners Inside the Afrikaner Broederbond, and I quote, members of women's organizations are invited to visit immigrant wives, arrange church services in the immigrants' languages, organize youth evenings, and ask immigrant families into their homes. The Broederbond was, quote, not prepared to sacrifice our traditional way of life, language, and culture, but it felt, quote, obliged to accept large-scale immigration as one of the most important aids in our struggle. In this way, the Broederbond felt that, quote, unassimilable elements will be kept out of South Africa and that immigration would not become a threat to the Afrikaner future and that immigrants would not deprive our people of jobs. These concerns, however, remained initially removed from Tam's cognitive affective map of her neighborhood, where she described immigrant families as a community forming close bonds despite being severed from their families and homelands. They were a part of their neighborhood, yet apart from their neighborhood. A part of South Africa, yet apart from South Africa. In this way, one could argue that some of the same struggles that apply to blacks under apartheid rule apply to immigrants, white immigrants as well, being a part of a country that they could not be a part of. This selective assimilation is perhaps best seen in Tam's description of her family's visit to what she calls the giant fascist wedding cake of the Voortrekker Monument. We must have seemed an odd apparition. My mother, with her jet black hair and lurid crimson dress, would have been completely out of place among those who were clothed more discreetly and possibly respectfully to visit this austere monument to Afrikanerdom. My father posed us in front of a huge bronze statue of a heroic Afrikaner mother protecting her children and took a photograph. We did not look like we were going to integrate successfully. Yet the family attempts to integrate, albeit in their own unique way, by interacting with the people and circumstances around them, slowly assimilating and adopting the country around them. Tam describes a friendship with a young domestic worker, Sophia, who worked for their neighbors, who she would go visit, quote, in her quarters at the back of the house. Once Tam's mother finds out about this friendship, she says, "You can't let the people see you sitting with servants. Why do you keep doing it?" Showing that Barbara had already internalized some of the apartheid regime rule of who one could and could not associate with. Most salient in terms of adopting a new country is perhaps Tam's description of the neighborhood where she lived, where, quote, there were two groupings of delinquents, ourselves, the English-speaking kids, and a pack of rough Afrikaners. Through the rough play, smoking, drinking, and interaction with friends, a cognitive affective map of a sort of belonging starts to develop, despite the family living on what is essentially the fringes of acceptability in apartheid South Africa. Tam describes how, playing at the Apies River, the threat of Belaja was, quote, one of the curses of moving to the third world. We can deal with segregation and racism, but not in heaven's name, Belaja. This was also the place where, quote, white children would be stalked and their little warm hearts cut out by crazed witch doctors. Even I can remember that these were touted as imminent threats growing up in 1980 South Africa. It would seem then that the cognitive affective maps of these immigrant families had started to successfully assimilate the realities and the perceived threats of apartheid South Africa. As she grows older, Tam's disillusionment with the South African political status quo grows, despite the curated stream of Afrikaner nationalism piped into communities by the media. Her growing awareness of the unjust treatments of Black South Africans is indelibly marked by the realization that this injustice has become acceptable and has faded to background noise. She wonders how, as a white person, whether willingly or unwillingly benefiting from an unjust regime, one finds a moral or political compass. She notes that pathogenic historical currents roiled beneath the appearance of order. In the race of life, she says, white children, quote, were at a starting line way ahead of everyone else, swept along wearing the running spikes of white affirmative action. Unmaking this constructed fraud becomes a lifelong task. It is when Tam starts working as a journalist in Cape Town years later that she comes face to face with this constructed fraud. As a journalist working the court beat, she saw on a daily basis the social injustice inflicted on the Black community through the cruel South African legal system. She is exposed to the violence of policing at the time, to death and injury, township lockdowns, and other what she calls unspeakable state transgressions. Tam's physical surroundings had also changed when she started working as a journalist. She moved from Pretoria to Cape Town and as a journalist was allowed to enter Black townships, where she was confronted with physical attacks on Black people, forced removal of inhabitants, tear gas and rubber bullet attacks, and other practices that fell under the label of white governmental population control. However, she never considers leaving this country with its highly charged and problematic socio-political troubles. Due to her parents' nationalities, she could easily have applied for British, Portuguese, or German citizenship. But she notes that many immigrants, like herself, quote, form a fervent attachment to their new homelands. Saliently, Tam uses the word adopted in her explanation as to why this occurs. Quote, Like religious converts, we desire to prove our loyalty and create for ourselves collective identities embedded in our adopted geographical space. My entire mental, political, and spiritual architecture, no matter how problematic, had been shaped through having grown up a white child in South Africa. I understood the country. It was part of me and I of it. Its music moved me to dance. Its perverse politics had burnt itself into my being. The words I italicized in this quote are especially salient to this topic we are discussing. Of course, the word adopted is pertinent. However, in my introduction, I noted that in Tam's adoption equation, she was the adoptee and South Africa the adopted parent. This excerpt, however, shows that Tam's adoption is a reciprocal event, as much as the country had adopted her, in as much as she could be adopted as an immigrant. She had also adopted the country. If we are to trace this phenomenon back to adoption studies itself, precedents for this reciprocal adoption are found in the literature. For example, the process during which an adoptee adopts an adoptive parent is called attachment. Though positive adoption experiences for adoptees lead to higher levels of attachment, even emotionally fraught adoptions see adoptees creating attachment relationships with adoptive parents. Tam is even afraid to leave South Africa to travel, afraid that she'll lose her sense of self, and as a South African of being, quote, unmoored and unhinged. It can be posited that Tam does form an attachment relationship with South Africa and has adopted it as much as it has adopted her. Though familiar with each other, the adoptee and adopter have a fraught relationship, with each one at least in part accepting the other. Further, Tam states that she feels no sense of kinship with Britain, Germany, or Portugal, showing a lack of attachment with these countries or her biological parents, despite her familial ties to them. She had not adopted these countries as her own. Explaining that she would also be considered unadoptable in these three countries, Tam says, quote, being a citizen of a third world country is to be made aware of one's essentially undesirable nature. Again relating to Singley's second adoption narrative strand that sees the adoptee as unadoptable. Returning now to Singley's first adopter strand, which refers to adoptees being able to take part in discourses of national new beginnings, I now turn to Tam's narration of the end of apartheid. She tells of P.W. Botha, then still president of South Africa, meeting the prisoner Nelson Mandela for tea at his presidential manor. This was followed by the overturning of prison sentences of many ANC members, F.W. de Klerk being elected president, and political prisoners being released from prison. In 1990, F.W. de Klerk announced Mandela's release from prison and the unbanning of the ANC and all other political organizations. Up to that point, Tam had adopted the journey of the Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin as a personal lodestar, stating that she wished she could attach herself to the Vostok to escape the oppressive South African regime and, quote, the dumb fuck 20th century. With de Klerk's announcement, Tam could for the first time see into the future, the 21st century, devoid of apartheid and with the promise of new freedoms. In this moment, apartheid died. To Tam, it was a feeling of, quote, finding oneself part of a massive and until then unthinkable historic moment, a bit like the moon landing. This is a salient remark because earlier in the memoir, Tam noted that South Africans were not part of the global phenomenon that was the 1969 moon landing. Televisions would only become available in South Africa after 1976, and the South African radio broadcasts provided scant coverage of the event. South Africa was isolated from global events by its political regime, a pariah country whose management sought to control the information its citizens were allowed to access. This announcement by de Klerk seemed to signify that at last South Africa could join the global community. As an adoptee of South Africa, Tam can be part of this momentous new beginning, not just in terms of the abolishment of an oppressive regime, but also in terms of her adopted parents' re-entry into the global fold. As an adopter who adopted South Africa as her own, Tam feels that she can now belong in a country that would ostensibly no longer discriminate against immigrants. However, she acknowledges that such new beginnings are not without worry, noting that the country was still cloaked in a miasma of the threat of violence. Die-hard apartheid supporters spoke of civil war, and many stockpiled provisions in fear of imagined revenge killings of whites that would be perpetrated by blacks after Mandela's release, which I vividly recall happening as a child. Even upon Mandela's release, when whites and blacks stood shoulder to shoulder, forming Archbishop Desmond Tutu's Rainbow Nation, Tam realizes that the concept of camaraderie playing out around her is merely a necessary fiction to temporarily distract citizens from the ingrained racial and cultural rifts that continue to plague South Africa to this day. However, Mandela's release is a new national beginning, and Tam becomes ever more hopeful as she finds her own political voice. It seems ironic, therefore, that Tam at this time decides to leave South Africa. She notes that she needed to find a neutral space where she could process her recent losses, resigning from her job as a journalist and separating from her lover, as well as her gains in terms of an apartheid-free country with burgeoning opportunities and freedoms. She decides to return to Europe, noting that she had never internalized any roadmap for her life, and that at the time, despite promising developments in South Africa, being a female journalist promised no career trajectory and same sex marriage was still taboo. South Africa's new beginnings urged Tam to look for new beginnings elsewhere. Stifled in her status as adoptee and adopter, filled with disenfranchised grief, she needed to escape. I wondered to myself whether I could equate Tam's traveling abroad to the adoptees' reunion journey, where they set out to find their first parents and biological families. The reunion journey is what Gallagher calls a period of psychological searching, allowing the adoptee to clarify their feelings towards adoption and both sets of parents. Adoption reunion also brings with them a sense of release and relief for the adoptee, says Verrier, who states that, quote, it's as if the adoptee had been holding his breath for all those years and could begin breathing again. There is a release of tension and a renewal of life. Such journeys also go hand in hand with the search for identity and perhaps even the creation of a new one, which is in essence what Tam yearns for. She no longer feels a sense of belonging in South Africa, yet, as previously stated, she also felt no such affect with European countries. This relates to an aspect of adoption reunions that Blake et al. Referred to as the no man's land of adoption reunions, where the adoptee feels as if they belong nowhere. No man's land, of course, refers to a space between two armies where no one is safe. However, as this space is fluid and hybrid, it allows the adoptee to move beyond the boundaries of being born to a family and born as if to a family. The adoptee can then transcend the born to and born as if to boundaries, allowing for the creation of a diverse, multiple, and fluid adopted identity. In Tam's case, this reunion journey starts out at the Hotel Rashid, a place where she had stayed during a previous European visit. She takes part in the renovation of this building, allowing her to escape from her disenfranchised grief through physical labor. The systematic labor and what she calls the freeing of the bricks and the mortar symbolizes her internalized process of deconstructing and reconstructing her sense of self. After a few months of living and working in the Hotel Rashid, she notes, quote, the blocks of my life started slotting into place. The physical and mental renovation allows her to discover her urge to move on, leading her first to London and then back to South Africa. Should we accept her travels to Europe as a reunion journey, Tam, the adoptee, first had to sever the ties with her adopter, South Africa, in order to reformulate her sense of identity. Though the reunion journey may not have included a search for her birth origins, it does carry with it the sense of release and relief mentioned by Verrier, as well as the reaffirmation of life and purpose, with, quote, the fog of uncertainty beginning to lift. Tam's return to South Africa is followed by a true harbinger of national new beginnings, the country's first democratic election during which Nelson Mandela would be elected as president. Her adoption of the country seems to be finalized in 1994 when she votes in a South African election for the first time. She notes that Nelson Mandela's release and presidency was not only the impetus behind the new constitution, but to her was also a symbol of healing, both in South Africa and in itself. Quote, Adolf Hitler and Hendrik Verwoerd might have stood as silent conductors of the discordant music of our souls, might have shaped some of the scaffolding of our minds, but it was Mandela and all he represented, compassion, justice, and humanity, who pointed the way out. He was the symbol, the embodiment of the realization that at times what hurts us can also come to heal us. Tam acknowledges that the country, its democracy, and its constitution are not without flaws. But even with these flaws, there is the promise of freedoms that were never previously afforded to her and other immigrants, as well as the indigenous population. With Mandela's election as president, she also comes to terms with her identity as both South Africa's adopter and adoptee. And I quote, Nationalist leaders had shaped my internal architecture and that of everyone with whom I shared this geographical space during that period. Without these dour men, there was no me, or at least a version of me. And then Mandela appeared and allowed for the first time the rudiments of a new dream and the possibility of a life to take shape. The possibility of fashioning a life not always in opposition to intrusive external forces. These new freedoms and possibilities indicate that South Africa now no longer considers Tam as unadoptable, as in Singlish second narrative strand. With these new national beginnings, Tam is welcomed into the fold of the new South Africa and also feels herself willing to adopt the country as her own, despite its flaws. It is only now at the end of this paper that I want to share with you why the Tam family immigrated to South Africa. Tam's father, Georg, had been recruited personally by Verwoerd, the architect of apartheid, to work as an engineer on the design of a new South African military rifle, the same rifles that would be used in the border war and in police actions during black protests and uprisings. Georg had chosen not once but twice to adopt an ideology based on the intended destruction of ethnic groups, the Jews under Hitler's regime and South Africa's black population under Verwoerd. To a large extent, I believe that Georg's skills rendered his family adoptable enough for apartheid South Africa, with the proviso that the family would integrate and assimilate. In the same breath, this fact is what for a long time prohibited Tam from adopting South Africa as her own. Here she notes she realizes that she is karmically doomed. Not only were there 6 degrees of separation between her and Adolf Hitler, but also between her and Hendrik Verwoerd. This is perhaps also the reason why her reunion journey to Europe did not grant her the feeling of acceptance she thought she would gain. She was both a part of Europe and South Africa, yet she was also apart from them. It was only with Nelson Mandela's release from prison that she started to feel she could reconcile herself with the new country that had at first deemed her unadoptable and that she struggled to adopt. Culminating in a new beginnings narrative, the post-apartheid regime signifies that South Africa would adopt back those it had rejected under apartheid and opens new possibilities for immigrants and the black populace to reciprocally re-adopt or adopt the country. the unadoptable becomes imminently adoptable, and Singley's second narrative memoir strand gives way to the first. Through a long and fraught navigation of cultural and spatial maps, which shaped her cognitive, affective, and semantic maps, Tam finally comes to be adopted by South Africa and vice versa. Yet she is aware that even the most well-adjusted adoptive relationships are not perfect, though, quote, the 20th century and all it had represented, apologies, all that I had found loathsome and oppressive became less stark, less jagged, and dangerous. She also notes that, quote, the remnants of history lurk all around us. As I mentioned earlier, my research focuses on representation in the adoption triangle. While many fictionalized adoption narratives present us with an essentialist view, adoption being either hellish or a fairy tale, Tam provides a more nuanced take on the lived experience of adoption, even in this extended form of adoption and the adoption triad. By highlighting the reciprocal immigrant/country adoption, that it has always been and will always be mired in ordering and bordering, adoptability and unadoptability, Tam foregrounds both past and present normativity in this adoption modus. Saliently, she engages in problematizing this normativity of unadoptability through navigating the terrain of apartheid and post-apartheid South Africa. She does not subscribe to the idea that the reciprocal readoption between country and its indigenous and immigrant populace is without problems and can never redress the injustices of the past. Rather, she opens the door for discussion on how the post-apartheid era can, for these parties, become an adoption reunion journey of their own. Thank you.
Yes, thanks so much, Hunter, for that very fascinating presentation on adoption narratives. Yes, I will invite questions, comments, and criticisms right away. You can just raise your hand, your digital hand, of course, to indicate your interest to either pose a question or comments on the presentation. So we have quite a number of our postgrad students, especially from the local campus, and I'm pretty sure that they learned one or two things about the way in which you used context and history, actually wielding them in your analysis of narratives. So perhaps while the questions are coming through, Hunter, perhaps I can take you back to Singley's narrative strands in adoption memoirs, particularly the first strand, which mentions, which conceptualizes, so to speak, the adopted child as saved. Perhaps you can expand on that. What is this notion of saving in this strand? How does Singley define this notion of saving? From what perspective or whose perspective or and context?
Okay, excellent question, Oliver. Singley's work on these adoption strands refers specifically to interracial and intercountry adoptees. So the concept, there's a prevailing concept that inter-country adoptions or interracial adoptions is saving these children from poverty or hunger or an uncertain future or human trafficking or whatever. And I think that is what Singley refers to as the act of saving. I have spoken before a lot about the white savior narrative, and frankly, just a general savior narrative that is inherent in adoption discourse. The fact that the adoptive parents are saving this child from whatever you can imagine. And I think that is what Singley refers to. I do not think this saving necessarily implies or applies so much to this memoir. In fact, I actually think it is the inverse, that the adoptee came to South Africa to save South Africa because there were no, or there was a lack of white skilled laborers. So it's actually an interesting inversion. Thanks for actually bringing that to my attention. I can add that to my chapter. An inversion also of the savior narrative in that strand. I hope that that answers your question.
Yes, it does. It does. Thanks for that explanation. Kudzai has a hand up.
Hi, Hunter. Again, thanks you again for the paper. My initial question, or just query, I just wanted to get, if I haven't read the book that you are writing on. I just wondered, as you read, is there any sense from since this is a memoir, is there any sense from the author that there was any sense of solidarity, I guess, amongst the divergent populations of immigrants, white, Asiatics, blacks, Jews, etc.? I know it doesn't relate directly to your main thrust, which is the adoption narrative.
No, it's fine. No, it's very interesting that you should ask that, because throughout the novel, the memoir, sorry, Tam really works at questioning what kinship means. Does kinship rely on consanguineal bonds? So she makes repeated reference to the immigrants being severed from their homelands and severed from their families. And she does describe, like, the immigrant community almost becomes an enclave inside the white neighborhood where they live. The larger Afrikaner neighborhood, and inside there's this enclave of immigrants. And they absolutely do have a sense of solidarity. She describes that they often visited each other. They had these loud outdoor gatherings where they would speak in their native tongues and so on. So there is absolutely a sense of solidarity there. And I think they felt a sense of solidarity with the Black population, but they did have this kind of honorary white or, privileged position that they could still operate from because they were white, even though we said that being Portuguese and white was a contentious issue. So she absolutely does describe that the immigrants had this sense of community and kinship and belonging. And it's very interesting to me that she also extends that to the white Afrikaans children they played with. Like she said, the rough Afrikaners and the English delinquents that she mentioned. That even with some of the Afrikaans children, she started to build a connection. But there are specific instances where she said, for example, she had a white friend called an Afrikaans friend called Rian, and she would go to his house to visit him, and he took out an atlas and he pointed to England and he says, "That's where you're from, you should go back there." And then she said, "But I'm not from England." So there is, despite tenuous friendships being made between the immigrants and the Afrikaners, there was still very much this element of you do not belong here. And that is why the immigrant community was so important for them, is I think this kind of collective feeling of we are not wanted. We are good enough to work here, but not really to be citizens. I think the immigrant community was very important in kind of creating that sense of kinship and belonging, especially since the immigrants had lost that, um, by leaving their families and their countries. I don't know if that answers your question. I hope so.
It most certainly does. Just as a quick follow-up, how inaccurate would it be to describe um, the migration or the migrant as perhaps a metaphor or trope for orphanhood?
Sorry, as a metaphor for what?
For orphanhood.
Orphanhood.
Yes.
That's actually that's a very, very good question. You're giving me such great input for my chapter. I appreciate it. I think that really is an excellent point. Especially because she tells of how her grandparents had already passed away. There's definitely a physical orphaning of people. We are talking post World War II, where a lot of the immigrants who came to South Africa had lost their families. But I do agree with you that in a certain sense, many of the immigrants were actually orphaned. And I think it is being an orphan that kind of makes it easier for you to, shall I say, come to this new country where perhaps there is a chance of creating a new family, nuclear family, when you have been separated from, what was your original family. Thanks, Kudzai.
You're welcome.
Yes, thanks, Kudzai. Iri.
Yes, thanks. Thank you, Hunter, for your presentation. It's really interesting. I like the history, as Oliver has pointed out, the intersection between life narratives, and history, and the story of the life. What do you call it? The Bildungsroman, or the story of, what do you call it? Growth, as it were. I I liked two concepts. Mine is more of a comment. I liked the way you refer to the map on adoption narratives, and then you use the idea of cartography or mapping and borders in there. It's fascinating. It's something that I work with, and I found another dimension which you were working with, which really made it interesting. Then there are also two things that I just want to add, just as a comment. It made me think about my first experience when I came to South Africa a long time ago. I had finished my master's and I was thinking about my PhD. So it was based on Johannesburg. I stayed with my cousin, but then they had just migrated from uh, Botswana, and they were looking for a place to buy. So we're moving around the suburbs in Senton, Morningside, and so forth. And I remember we went to a certain suburb, which is particularly for the Portuguese community. And they were having, what do they call it? I don't know if it is a theaters. I'm not so sure what it was, which was at an open park. And it was a festive. It was a day of family and celebration of Portuguese food, music, and so forth. So the history of this country also has um, the presence of a huge migrant community, and in particular the Portuguese, those that came not only from Europe after the Second World War, but others that came after the fall of the Portuguese empire, Angola, and in particular Mozambique. So that was just something that I thought about. Then there is this other angle which interested me, which is the class dimension, the borderings, the borders between class on adoption and adoptee, and whiteness becomes something that unites all the, for instance, the author. But then there are borders, class borders. In other words, borders that are created within the white community that made it very tough for the narrator and author as they were growing up. There's a book that I was working on. I never went through by W.A. Ballinger, or Dr. Howard Becker. It's called Call It Rhodesia. It's an interesting book that starts from pre-colonial to the about 1965 when we have the UDR in Zimbabwe. In the last days of the last chapters, it describes experiences of the white migrants, the huge wars that were between the Irish and the Portuguese and other migrant workers. The fights, it was huge as they fought over, territory, jobs, and just plain jokes and whatever, categorization, what do you call it, hierarchy and racial hierarchies and so forth. So yeah, your paper took me in all directions, and it was quite interesting. Thanks for that.
Thanks, Eri. Actually, as I was writing this paper, I kept thinking of you. You were always popped into my mind, and I'm like, I don't want to say anything that's going to offend Eri or any other of our colleagues who are immigrants as well. But it's very interesting to me that you mentioned those neighborhoods where the Portuguese lived, because I remember vividly going there. The one area was called Vemerpan, and it had this fountain, which was a musical fountain and lights and everything. And then you went there, and the area was called Lusito Land, because of the Portuguese that lived here. But I remember going there was such a rare occasion because it's a Portuguese neighborhood. It's so dangerous, you know. So yeah, and thanks for telling me about that book. I'm definitely going to check it out.
All right then.
Yes, we have more hands. Peter?
Hi, Hunter. It's actually not Peter speaking. It's Motsusi. We're speaking from the Reciprocal campus. And I just wanted to say, your presentation was quite fascinating. I did come with it with my own preconceptions, because I'm a born free, I'm Black. I'm very sensitive to what apartheid did to our population, but I was shocked, to kind of see the ambivalences, the logical contradictions, and you know, the dynamics involved within the construction of apartheid and the ideological architecture which propelled it forward. So that is quite an eye opener. Um, well, basically, my question is, would you have any more recommendations, particularly in regards to maybe recent fiction which is coming out, which is capturing this dissatisfaction or the alienation with some white sections of especially South Africans are feeling, especially in the post 1994 era. I think it's quite a fascinating road to explore this level of language and the concepts which are coming out. But I was just looking at any texts which would be coming out in the post 2000s or recently, which are looking at similar thematic concerns.
Um, thank you, and no. um, because my research focused on the adoption narratives, I'm much more into reading, the adoption things that are specifically about adoption. But I have found a couple of things that are similar. And if you don't mind sending me an email, I would very gladly send you a list of these narratives. And I think it's interesting also to me because I did grow up in the latter part of apartheid South Africa as obviously a privileged white person. So it's very interesting to me to see the white discrimination, the language discrimination. You know, we were not, well, I was not aware necessarily of the huge discrimination between Afrikaans and English people. And I was aware that we called Portuguese people poras, and we called the English people soutpile, which means salt dicks, and they called us, the Afrikaans people, rock spiders. But we lived in such a hermetic environment that it was only when I read this memoir that I became aware of just how bad it was. So I would be very happy to send you a few recommendations if you send me an email.
Thank you.
Yes. Do we have further questions or comments? I don't see any.
Someone had their hand up earlier. I don't know if it was Tina or.
Oh yeah, it was Martin Kumalo. I think he dropped.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. But Hunter, you, I think you were quite clear that this is part of your broader PhD project, right?
Yes.
Yes, and having listened to your previous talk, it brought me some memories of what I went through in my Viva some time ago, my PhD Viva. Like you, I used texts from so many genres, fiction, long form, the novel, short stories, poetry. And one of my examiners asked me a question that I'm not sure in the heat of the Viva I actually answered, or uh, I, I just noted or acknowledged. The question was perhaps it may be relevant to your own work and also how you are using your text. The question was, and perhaps it is to you, how do you deal with the different ways in which these genres make meaning? To say, how do you navigate across, the genres from fiction to nonfiction, autobiographies, particularly in the ways in which they make meaning or create discourses?
Mm. It's a very good question. Because my research is concerned with representation, it's important for me to look at representation in terms of material that was written based on lived experience of adoption, and representation based on fictionalized representations. So I only look at one fictional novel, which is Phila's Child, that I spoke on last time, and then I look at two memoirs. And it is difficult to bridge the gap, because you kind of have to keep reminding yourself that Phila's Child is, it's narrated characters. The characters are not real people. They are narrated, and you constantly have to see it through the point of view of the author. So you kind of see it through the author, through the character. Whereas with the memoir, although I mean memoirs are still narrativized, it is more an expression of lived experience. So it's kind of as if you have more of a first-hand look. And that's why this thing of mapping keeps recurring in this, because to bridge the genres, you have to look at things like, what are the semantic maps that are employed to tell these stories, and how are the semantic maps shaped by the stories? What are the cognitive affective maps of the characters versus the people who explain their lived experience? Do they kind of have similarities or differences? And what does that tell us about narrativized representations of adoption versus lived experience representations of adoption? So it is a challenge, but I hope that through doing this whole mapping thing, I can come to, kind of semi-conclusion about, specifically the representation in South African adoption narratives. And I'm quite lucky, I think, in that sense, in the fact that there are not many South African adoption narratives yet. So that makes it a bit easier. I hope that answers your question, but sorry, but I see Noluthando also has a question, and we're almost out of time. So if you don't mind, I'm going to give the mic to Noluthando.
Good afternoon, everyone, and good afternoon to the presenter. Well, mine is not really a question, but a comment and an appreciation to the presentation. I was fascinated and liked how the history is connected from both South Africa to even South Africa, and also how the adoptive narrative strands are mentioned, which is also fascinating, and also to how South Africa is viewed as the adoptive parent according to the mentioned strains. And lastly, I'm also fascinated about how you portrayed the ways in which the adoptees can also be adoptive parents in issues connected with attachment. And also from the first presentation we had, I think it was last semester, can the concept of mothering be connected somewhere somehow towards this presentation you have presented?
Absolutely. That's a fantastic point, Nolutando, is the concept of mothering. I haven't actually thought about that, but especially when you start using terms like motherland and so on, where is the mother? Which country is mothering you? Which country are you mothering? And what does that entail for mothering? If we go back to what I discussed last time with pronatalism and biological privilege, those things are completely removed when we talk about adopting a country. But in a sense, it is still relevant because it is not a biological relationship when you are an immigrant. It is, as you say, it is an aspect of attachment is definitely relevant there. So that's an excellent point. Thank you so much. The mothering point of view is definitely one I need to consider. Thanks, Nolutando.
Yes, thanks, Hanta and Nolutando, for that contribution. I think that leads me to thank our presenter today, Hanta Henning. Thanks so much for your fascinating presentation, and we wish
Thanks,
you all the best with the long format.
I will submit next year. Yes.
Yes, we are looking forward to it, of course. And yes, let me also extend my thanks to our audience today. In particular, special mention to our postgrad students. Thanks so much for coming, and everyone else. We will see you in a fortnight. Thanks and bye.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. It was fantastic having you as an audience. Thanks for
Okay.
listening to me, and have
All
a
right.
great day.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.